A lot of times, when we hear the word poet, we think of stuffy old guys wearing funny clothes and using big long words that we don't really understand. While in some cases that's definitely true, Gwendolyn Brooks is not one of those poets. She isn't a stuffy old guy, she didn't wear funny clothes, and she didn't use too many big crazy words. In fact, her poetry is probably some of the easiest for kids and adults alike to enjoy. We're going to learn a little more about her today. I'm Miss Kate, and this is Fun Facts.
Welcome to Fun Facts. We're bringing you real facts about real people, places, animals, and science every Monday and Wednesday.
Gwendolyn Brooks was born in Topeka, Kansas on June 7th, 1917, but she didn't stay in Kansas for very long. When she was only 6 weeks old, her family packed up everything they had and moved up to Chicago, where Miss Brooks would spend the rest of her life. They came up here in something called the Great Migration. This was a time in history where a lot of black families moved from the southern states up to the northern states because the northern states had better opportunities for jobs, and the laws in the southern states were often really unkind to black people, and it was a little bit better up in the north. Once the Brooks family reached Chicago, Mr. Brooks got a job working as a janitor in a music factory, and Mrs. Brooks, who herself was a trained piano player, got a job working as a teacher. Though the family didn't have a whole lot of money for things like toys, they always had music and poetry in the house. Someone was always playing the piano, and Mr. Brooks in particular loved to read poetry out loud to his family on holidays. The rhythms of the music and the words of the poems shaped Gwendolyn from a very early age, and she started writing her very own poems when she was only 7 years old. She kept practicing until she was about 11, at which time she sent 4 of her poems to some of the biggest newspapers and magazines in Chicago, and one of them actually published her work. At only 11 years old, Gwendolyn Brooks was a published poet. When Gwendolyn was a teenager, the Great Depression struck the country. This meant that everybody in the U.S. was struggling to get money and find jobs, and for a family where things were already tight, things became even tighter. On top of all of this, Gwendolyn was also being bullied in school since she was one of the few black girls in her class. Despite all this hardship, she continued writing poetry, and she channeled all of her fear and all of the sadness she felt about being picked on into her writing. She kept on going, and by the time she graduated from high school and went off to college, she was already considered a regular contributor to a Chicago newspaper called The Defender that printed mostly African American writers. You can learn more about Gwendolyn Brooks' childhood and her early poetry in Exquisite: The Poetry and Life of Gwendolyn Brooks by Suzanne Slade. This book focuses in particular on what it was like growing up in the Brooks family, and it shows some of Gwendolyn's earliest poetry, so you can see what exactly she was writing when she was 7, 11, and even 15 years old. But just because she was considered a famous poet now didn't mean that Gwendolyn stopped writing. In fact, she wrote 2 more books, several more books of poetry, and she started working with other African American women who wanted to become poets to teach them how to do it themselves. While she was doing all of this, she never lost her love for her city and her neighborhood. She even wrote another book of poetry about Bronzeville, but this one was all for kids. It's called Bronzeville Boys and Girls, and all of the poems in it are inspired by games that she saw her kids playing with their friends on their home street. These are all specifically for kids, so all the poems are super short, they're all really silly, and they're about things like tea parties and annoying little brothers and sisters. Things that were important to the kids of Bronzeville and are still important to kids in River Forest today. But Bronzeville wasn't the only thing that Miss Brooks knew how to write about. She also wrote a number of poems and stories about her experiences growing up as a young black woman in a world that didn't believe the black and white people were equal. In fact, her writing was one of the things that made a lot of citizens realize that this was horribly unfair and that it needed to stop immediately. It wasn't just regular people who noticed this too. She was winning all kinds of awards for what she was doing. She was the first African American woman to ever win the Pulitzer Prize for Writing in 1950, which is one of the highest awards that you can win for being a writer. She was also nominated as the Poet Laureate of Illinois later in her life. This meant that her poetry was considered the representation for the entire state of Illinois. That's pretty freaking cool, isn't it? She also got to teach at several colleges. Many of them were still in the city of Chicago, but some of them were in New York, Boston, and other places as well. If you want to learn more about Gwendolyn Brooks and about other amazing Black women just like her who changed the world, you should check out Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History by Vashti Harrison. This book is really cool. It talks about several different innovators, all of whom were Black women, and each one gets her own drawing and a page that tells you a bit more about their life. This is the Gwendolyn Brooks page. It's nice and short, but it's a lot of information and it's all super important. I think everyone should read this. All right, friends, that's all that we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining me for fun facts and for learning about Gwendolyn Brooks with me. But for right now, I am Miss Kate. I will be here at the library and I hope I get to see all of you very soon.